The decline of European colonialism and dominance was a slow, transformative process that culminated in several key events following World War II. Among these, the Suez Crisis of 1956 is widely regarded as the final blow to Europe's imperial ambitions. It is seen as the moment when Europe's global dominance came to an end, and the United States solidified its role as the world's leading power. This essay explores in detail how the United States played a pivotal role in ending European colonialism, focusing particularly on the Suez Crisis, and how this led to the birth of the multipolar world that we see today. The United States' influence on the end of European colonialism was multifaceted, involving diplomatic pressure, economic power, military interventions, and ideological influence. In the broader context, the US led a global shift from European imperialism toward decolonization and helped create a world order that would no longer be centered on European powers. This essay will cover the historical background, key events, and the impact of US policies on European colonialism, concluding with an analysis of the multipolar world that emerged as a result of these developments. Historical background, European colonialism, and the pre-World War II era. European colonialism began in earnest during the Age of Discovery in the 15th century, as nations like Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands expanded their empires across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Over the next few centuries, European powers carved out large territories and established colonies, exploiting resources and local populations for their economic benefit. By the 19th century, the European empires had expanded to control much of the world. However, the rise of nationalism and the growth of anti-colonial movements in the colonies posed increasing challenges to European dominance. In many parts of the world, including India, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, local populations began to resist foreign control, seeking self-determination and independence. Despite these movements, European powers remained committed to their colonial empires, and it took the cataclysmic events of World War II to truly weaken the colonial powers. The impact of World War II on European colonialism. World War II was a critical turning point in the decline of European colonialism. The war significantly weakened the European powers, both economically and militarily. Countries like Britain and France, once mighty global powers, were devastated by the conflict and could no longer sustain the enormous costs of maintaining overseas colonies. Additionally, the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as the two new superpowers during and after the war overshadowed the European colonial empires. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, further indicated the changing global landscape. The Charter emphasized the right of all peoples to self-determination, a principle that stood in direct opposition to colonialism. Though Britain and other European powers initially hoped to maintain their empires after the war, the ideological pressure from the US, combined with the financial strain from the war, made this increasingly difficult. In the immediate post-war years, decolonization began to take shape across the world. India, one of the largest and most prominent British colonies, gained independence in 1947. France faced challenges in Vietnam and Algeria, while Dutch control in Indonesia was weakened. In many cases, the United States played an active or passive role in supporting the movements for independence, either by advocating for the principle of self-determination or by withholding support for European colonial ambitions. The role of the United States in promoting decolonization. While the United States had its own complex history of expansionism and territorial control, including the annexation of territories like Hawaii and the Philippines, it generally positioned itself as an anti-colonial power in the post-World War II era. There were several reasons for this. First, American leaders saw colonialism as incompatible with the principles of democracy and freedom that the US championed. Secondly, the United States was keen to prevent the spread of communism in newly independent nations, and supporting their independence was seen as a way to win their favor in the Cold War. Diplomatic pressure on European powers. The US applied significant diplomatic pressure on European powers to grant independence to their colonies. In particular, President Roosevelt had clashed with Churchill during the war, pushing Britain to consider granting independence to its colonies after the war. This diplomatic pressure continued in the post-war era as the US leveraged its influence through organizations like the United Nations to advocate for decolonization. Economic influence. After World War II, the US implemented the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid program that helped rebuild Western Europe. However, this aid came with certain conditions, including a general expectation that European powers would begin to relinquish their colonies. As Britain, France, and other European nations became increasingly dependent on American financial assistance, they had little choice but to comply with these expectations. Support for independence movements. The US often provided political or material support to independence movements in colonial regions, particularly when these movements aligned with American strategic interests in the Cold War. For example, the US supported anti-colonial efforts in regions where European powers were seen as oppressive or where communist movements threatened to take control. In some cases, this support was direct, while in other cases, it involved working through proxies or international organizations. Cold War strategy. The Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union was a driving factor behind US support for decolonization. The US feared that newly independent countries would fall under the influence of communism if they did not receive American support. By advocating for their independence and offering economic and military aid, the US aimed to bring these nations into its sphere of influence. This strategy was evident in the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The Suez Crisis of 1956, the final blow to European colonialism. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is often considered the turning point in the decline of European colonialism, as it highlighted the end of Britain and France's ability to act as global powers without US support. The crisis began when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway that was jointly controlled by Britain and France. In response, Britain, France, and Israel launched a military intervention to seize control of the canal. However, the intervention was met with strong opposition from the United States. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was furious that Britain and France had acted unilaterally without consulting the US or securing its approval. Eisenhower viewed the intervention as destabilizing and feared that it would drive Egypt closer to the Soviet Union, undermining American interests in the region. The US response was swift and decisive. Eisenhower applied significant economic and diplomatic pressure on Britain and France, threatening to withdraw financial support and sell off British bonds, which would have severely damaged the British economy. Facing this immense pressure, Britain and France were forced to withdraw their forces from Egypt, leaving Nasser in control of the canal. The Suez Crisis was a humiliating defeat for Britain and France, marking the end of their ability to act as independent global powers. It was also a clear demonstration that the United States had become the dominant power in the Western world. From this point forward, European nations would have to align their foreign policies with those of the US if they hoped to maintain their influence on the global stage. The Suez Crisis signaled the end of European colonialism and the beginning of a new world order in which the United States would play the dominant role. However, the US did not simply replace European colonialism with its own form of imperialism. Instead, the US helped to create a more multipolar world by promoting decolonization and supporting the rise of new independent nations. Decolonization and the rise of new powers. As European empires crumbled, dozens of new countries gained their independence. Many of these newly independent nations aligned themselves with neither the US nor the Soviet Union, forming what came to be known as the non-aligned movement. This movement sought to avoid entanglement in the Cold War rivalry and to pursue independent paths of development. In this way, the US inadvertently helped to foster a multipolar world. in which power was more evenly distributed among nations. The role of international organizations. The US also played a key role in the creation of international organizations like the United Nations, which provided a forum for newly independent nations to assert their sovereignty and voice their concerns. These organizations helped to level the playing field between the old colonial powers and the newly independent countries, further contributing to the emergence of a multipolar world. Economic assistance and development. In the post-colonial era, the US provided significant economic assistance to developing nations through programs like the Marshall Plan and the Point 4 program. These programs helped to stabilize newly independent nations and prevent them from falling into chaos or turning to communism. By promoting economic development in these countries, the US helped to foster the growth of new centers of power, contributing to the multipolar world we see today. Conclusion: the United States and the transition to a multipolar world. The United States played a critical role in ending European colonialism and bringing about the transition to a multipolar world. Through diplomatic pressure, economic influence, and strategic support for decolonization, the US helped to dismantle the European empires and pave the way for the emergence of newly independent nations. While the United States emerged as the dominant global power in the immediate aftermath of World War II, it also facilitated the rise of other centers of power, leading to the more diversified international system we witness today. The legacy of the Suez Crisis and the shift in global power. The Suez Crisis, as the last major attempt by European powers to assert their influence through military intervention, was a critical juncture in the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. The way the United States handled the situation demonstrated that European imperial ambitions no longer had a place in the post-war order. It also signaled the weakening of European influence over their former colonies, particularly in the Middle East and Africa. The ramifications of the Suez Crisis were profound in multiple ways. 1. The decline of European influence in the Middle East. The Suez Crisis effectively ended Britain and France's dominance in the Middle East, a region they had controlled through colonial arrangements and mandates after World War I. Egypt's President Nasser emerged as a symbol of Arab nationalism, and the successful nationalization of the Suez Canal without foreign intervention emboldened anti-colonial and nationalist movements throughout the region. As Britain and France retreated, the US and the Soviet Union became the primary external actors in Middle Eastern politics. In many ways, the Suez Crisis marked the end of Europe's involvement in shaping the political landscape of the Middle East. The power vacuum left by the European withdrawal created opportunities for the US and the USSR to compete for influence in this strategically important region, with both sides backing different factions during the Cold War. The region's future would be defined not by European imperialism, but by superpower rivalry and the aspirations of local nationalist movements. 2. The rise of pan-Arabism and non-alignment. Nasser's ability to withstand pressure from European powers elevated his status not just in Egypt, but across the Arab world. He became a leading figure in the broader pan-Arab movement, which sought to unite the Arab states under a single political framework free from foreign domination. The rise of Nasserism and Pan-Arabism also signaled the decline of the colonial-era spheres of influence that Britain and France had established in the region. Additionally, Nasser's success bolstered the non-aligned movement, NAM, which was composed of countries that refused to take sides in the Cold War. Formed officially in 1961 in Belgrade, NAM was led by countries like India, Egypt, Indonesia, and Yugoslavia, which sought to forge their own path without becoming subservient to the US or the USSR. This movement significantly contributed to the shift from a world dominated by a few Western powers to a more multipolar global order. US policies and the Cold War context. Strategic decolonization. During the Cold War, US policy on decolonization was largely shaped by its desire to limit Soviet expansion and ensure that newly independent nations aligned with the West. Although the US supported decolonization as a principle, its approach was often pragmatic, aimed at ensuring that the process of decolonization did not lead to the rise of communist governments in former colonies. This policy was evident in various global regions, including Africa, Asia, and Latin America. 1. Support for gradual decolonization. The US often advocated for a more gradual process of decolonization, in contrast to the sudden and violent uprisings that took place in some regions. American policymakers believed that a slow and orderly transfer of power would ensure that newly independent nations had stable governments that were not vulnerable to communist takeovers. For instance, in countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya, the US encouraged colonial powers to prepare for independence by establishing democratic institutions and fostering political stability. 2. Containment and proxy wars. In some cases, US involvement in decolonization was influenced by its broader strategy of containment, the effort to prevent the spread of communism. This was particularly evident in Southeast Asia, where the US became deeply involved in Vietnam after the French withdrawal from the region. Fearing that the fall of Vietnam to communism would lead to a domino effect throughout the region, the US stepped in to support South Vietnam against the communist North. While this intervention had disastrous consequences for both the region and US foreign policy, it underscored the degree to which decolonization was entangled in the global ideological struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. In Africa, a similar dynamic unfolded, with the US and the USSR backing different factions in newly independent countries. For example, in the Congo crisis, 1960 to 1965, the US and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides in the conflict over control of the mineral-rich country after Belgian decolonization. Such proxy wars became a hallmark of Cold War-era decolonization, as both superpowers sought to gain influence in former European colonies. 3. Economic and developmental aid. In the immediate post-war period, the US also provided significant economic aid to developing nations through initiatives like the Truman Doctrine and the Point 4 program. The aim was to offer these countries an alternative to Soviet influence by providing them with technical assistance and financial support for development projects. By fostering economic growth and political stability, the US hoped to prevent newly independent nations from turning to communism. For many newly independent nations, American aid offered a lifeline during a period of intense social and economic transformation. However, the strings attached to US aid, such as alignment with Western geopolitical goals, often caused tension between the recipients and the US. This dynamic would play out repeatedly throughout the Cold War, with developing nations attempting to navigate the complex web of global power politics while retaining their newfound sovereignty. The final stages of European decolonization and the US role. By the 1960s and 1970s, the process of decolonization was well underway in most of the world, with many African, Asian, and Caribbean nations gaining independence. The role of the United States in this process continued to evolve as it sought to balance its support for decolonization with its strategic interests in countering Soviet influence. 1. The end of the British and French empires. The British Empire, once the largest in history, gradually dissolved in the decades following World War II. After India's independence in 1947, Britain decolonized much of Africa and Asia, including Kenya, Malaysia, Nigeria, and Tanzania. The Suez Crisis had made it clear that Britain could no longer maintain an empire without American backing, and British leaders began to focus on maintaining a special relationship with the US rather than on preserving their overseas empire. France's decolonization process was more violent, particularly in Algeria, where a brutal war of independence raged from 1954 to 1962. The US, though sympathetic to France's internal struggle, ultimately prioritized stability and the containment of communism over supporting French colonial ambitions. American leaders encouraged France to relinquish its colonies, which would open the door for US influence in regions like North Africa and Southeast Asia. 2. Decolonization in Africa. The decolonization of Africa accelerated in the 1960s as one country after another gained independence from European rule. In many cases, the US played a role in supporting the transition to independence, either by providing diplomatic support or by offering economic aid to newly independent governments. However, in some instances, the US also supported authoritarian regimes that were seen as reliable anti-communist allies, even if they did not adhere to democratic principles. The US policy of supporting friendly regimes, regardless of their democratic credentials, was exemplified in countries like Mobutu Sese Seko's Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where US support helped sustain a dictatorship that aligned with American interests. This pragmatic approach to decolonization often clashed with the idealistic rhetoric of promoting freedom and democracy, but it reflected the complexities of the Cold War era. In conclusion, the United States played a decisive role in ending European colonialism, with the Suez Crisis of 1956 marking the symbolic end of Western European dominance. Through diplomatic, economic, and military influence, the US helped dismantle colonial empires and promoted decolonization, shaping a new global order. This shift from imperialism to independence allowed emerging nations to assert their sovereignty, leading to the rise of a multipolar world where power is shared across diverse global actors. The legacy of these actions continues to define international relations today.